back their money. And maybe this is where the SMEs come in, because they're high risk, then they were not getting credit, but banks were ensuring that they were safe throughout this whole period. Now, moving on from this, we've already explained how this could have been working. Banks were holding back from lending to risky clients, hence decline of bad debt. In the presidential memo, the president noted that lending to SMEs, because of the interest rates, had gone down by about 10%. Okay, so SMEs that were going to borrow from the banks could not borrow because banks were assessing the client. When you go, they want collateral, they want to be sure that you'll be able to pay them back their money, because the interest rates are really low, so they're not making a lot of money in terms of profit from lending you their money. And we saw a shift. So the banks were no longer lending to the private sector. Instead, they were lending to the government. And we saw a rise in domestic borrowing, because now the government and the national treasury could borrow very cheaply from the domestic market at very good rates. So you also saw banks invest in the real estate sector. They were buying T-bills, which are treasury bonds, instead of putting this money out there for people to be able to borrow this money. And this is because banks were holding on to their money because they weren't comfortable with the interest rate cap. This is just among the reasons that the president saw it fit to ask Parliament to repeal the interest rate cap, so that credit can go back to flowing to the SME sector. But that is a wait and see. Will it work? Is it a magic bullet? Where do we go from here? Do we really need interest rate caps? Do we need to repeal them? How do we bring interest rates down to single digit? How do we reduce our fiscal deficit? How do we reduce our debt burden so that interest rates can go down? This and much more on the second part of the show, where I'll be joined with our experts to have the conversation. Stay with Metropole TV. A very good evening to you, and thank you very much for staying with Metropole TV. This is Metropole Debrief, and I am your host, Ondiro Ganga. We've already gone through the first bit of the show. We've put in numbers into context, and we've seen that in 2016, when the interest rate caps were introduced, there wasn't much effect on the market. Then in 2017, a year later, there was a little bit of a shock as the market was trying to readjust to the new environment that it was being subjected to, which was the interest rate capping. And then in 2018, we are seeing an improvement, something more like the market was trying to correct itself. However, we have an expert in studio with us to put some of these things into context. Where do we go from here now that the interest rate cap has been repealed and banks can voluntarily charge you whatever interest rates they want? Are we going back to the expensive regime of 2015-2016, where banks were charging up to 30%, or are we going to see a reasonable interest rate being charged on Kenyans? Isaac Njuguna, CEO of Zimele Asset Management, thank you very much for making time.
Thank you.
On Tuesday, a very interesting day. In the morning, we had a debate with members of Parliament debating about the interest rate cap. They were very hopeful that they will raise numbers and overturn the presidential memorandum. Fast forward a couple of hours later in the afternoon, they go to Parliament. They're unable to raise quorum to overturn the presidential memorandum, and hence a repeal of the interest rate cap. From your understanding, was it time to repeal the caps?
Perhaps it depends on which side you're seated. I guess if you're in the government shoes, if you're in the bank shoes, they probably felt that that was the right time, because there was a feeling that it was starving credit to areas where it was supposed to go, like SMEs and individuals. But of course, if you're the borrower, if you're the SMEs, if you're the micro level businesses, then of course it's not probably a good thing, because we've been here before. Banks will say they'll maintain lending rates at a certain level. But of course, things always seem to go the other way. So I guess it depends with where you are. But by and large, there's the expectation that we are going back to where we were before the rate cap era.
Yes. And the rate cap, let's just discuss it a little bit briefly.
Yes.
has it served its purpose? Did it serve its purpose? Because on one hand, we were saying it's not a good thing because it's choking SMEs of the credit that it direly needs. But on the other hand, we are saying at least banks are not charging exorbitant rates, because even Habil Olaka himself has come up publicly and admitted that Kenyan banks are one of the most profitable institutions in the whole world. Yes. Is it that we rushed the interest rate cap, we didn't give it enough time, or it just wasn't going to work?
I'll probably break it down in a very, very simple way. In the standard reasoning or the standard position, any controls in any market are supposed to bring in shortages. That's one. And there, of course, we had a situation where the feeling was that banks were not giving out as much credit to where it was intended. But two, as an outcome of that shortage, you also end up having businesses not performing well in terms of profitability being affected. Now, banking is a very, very sensitive industry. And if the rate cap development was playing out according to what had been feared earlier, one would have actually seen banks, majority of them, go into loss-making territory. That did not happen. Two, would have actually experienced a period of financial instability because of that, and of course the resultant loss of confidence in the public. That did not happen. So I guess on that basis alone, did rate caps affect the profitability of banks? No. Because if you look at it right now, the same big banks that are making double-digit return on investment ratios are still continue to make the same returns. Even for the smaller banks, their profitability, well, remained relatively unchanged. There are other factors, I guess, that were, to blame for the outcome that we saw, but not necessarily that it was because of the rate cap on its own. Yes.
And now that there's a repeal, are we going to see credit being unlocked to people that need it, MSMEs, SMEs, and even ordinary Kenyans? Because the president in his memorandum